My name is John Torosyan, and I was born in Istanbul, Turkey. When I was 6 years old, my father decided that we had to leave Istanbul. This was as a result of 3 years before a ransacking of all the minority shops. My father at the time was agent for Massey Ferguson tractors and RHP bearings, and they took all the stock of the bearings and they drove the tractors through the showroom windows. And he has always told me that this was the last straw and that he refused to build a business up in such a country. So in 1960, leaving everything behind, business, house, furniture, everything, leaving the lights on so that no one would suspect that we'd even gone. Two families, ourselves and the Kaptan family, in one car, went across the border at Edirne. We landed up in Bulgaria, in a demilitarized zone and caught by the Soviet soldiers. We explained our position, that we were leaving Turkey. They fully understood we were Armenians, and they let us go. It was quite a horrendous experience because they did hold us at gunpoint for a while. Then, slowly we made ourselves through Europe, and the Kaptan family settled in France, and we settled in the UK. The exodus from Turkey was the final stage of an exodus which started out near Van. My grandfather's grandfather was from Van. They moved to Kayseri, Caesarea, and from Kayseri eventually to Istanbul. It was a gradual migration of the family after the genocide from Western Armenia to Istanbul, the cosmopolitan center, and eventually out completely from Turkey. So we settled in the UK in 1960. It was a very hard struggle. Unlike today, there was little known about asylum. There was certainly no benefits, and my father struggled for 7 or 8 years to just come off the breadline. It was a very, very difficult time. He carried on the initial business, which was motor spare parts. He specialized in Land Rover spare parts from 1962-3 onwards. That's all we did. And eventually, this business grew and grew, and we were very fortunate because we had lost everything from Turkey. We came out with one carpet, which is now in our living room. And he built the business back up from scratch. A successful business which went on for 50 years until it was sold to another party. It was a third generation business, and it was solely to do with Land Rover spare parts.
The history of how my family came to settle in Iraq really is a nucleus of the history of the Armenian people. My father's side of the family settled in Baghdad, Iraq in the mid-1600s. Shah Abbas, when he tried to invade Baghdad, he had an Armenian general, and this Armenian general was capable to penetrate the fortresses and the borders of Baghdad and actually invade Baghdad. And in return, as a reward to his success, Shah Abbas gave him a quarter in Baghdad, which is known until today as the Armenian, old Armenian section. And thus, an Armenian church was built there, which still exists, built in the late 1600. And the descendants of this Armenian, known as the Baghdadsi Armenians, the Armenians who are natives to Baghdad for 4 or 5 generations. As far as I recall, my father telling me his grandfather's grandfather was born in Baghdad. So that reflects one slice of the history of our people, which were deported from Armenia to Julfa, and then from Julfa via Iran to Baghdad. My mother's side of the family is the other side of the history of our people. Her parents are from historic Armenia, Malatya, and because of the genocide and the deportation, my grandmother actually had to march at the age of 12, 13 from Malatya all the way to the northern parts of Iraq, and that's how I can trace my family back to historic Armenia.
I asked my father and my mother, what has been going on? What is this issue with Turkey? None of them ever explained to me truly about the genocide. Not my grandfather, because I was too small to understand, and because they would never speak about the genocide. And not my father or my mother. I've always wondered why my grandfather or my parents never spoke about the genocide. Perhaps it was the same reason I was not allowed to speak Armenian in the streets. Perhaps they were too traumatized. From what I can understand now, it appears that 80% of the family were lost. No one knows where. No graves, no news. So eventually, I started digging into it myself. And I found out that the country that I'm living in today, the United Kingdom, doesn't recognize the Armenian genocide. Other countries do, but this one doesn't. I was amazed. We were promised recognition many times. We're always told that we would be remembered. But in the United Kingdom, it never happens. So I became, as many Armenians, totally obsessed with the recognition issue. This doesn't just apply to me. All of the Armenians that I know that live in Cardiff are obsessed about the recognition as I am. I'm not unique. And I think there are many, many Armenians all around the world that are become as obsessive about the genocide as I am. So we started work within Wales on how at least this part of the country could recognize the genocide. I was fortunate to have known some great Welshmen who helped.
Well, we have a question time. We have a governing body which is the equivalent of the General Synod in the Church of England, and I'm a member of that governing body. And there's a question time, which is an opportunity for people to put questions to the bishops. So I asked a question to the bishops: would they be willing to recognize April the 24th as Armenian Genocide Day? And of course, the bishops, being bishops, knew very little about it, or being Welsh bishops, I should say, knew little about it. So they went and did a bit of research, and the Bishop of Swansea and Brecon, who actually had a copy of my book but clearly hadn't read it, when he answered, was extremely keen that we should. He was horrified by what he had discovered about the Armenian genocide, and he said that he would ask the bench of bishops, his fellow bishops, if they would recognize the day, and they agreed to recognize the day. Bishop Vahan kindly helped with some prayers, and I translated those into Welsh, and so we produced a bilingual booklet which was also on the Church in Wales website, of prayers that could be used on the 24th of April.
I must confess, before meeting Canon Patrick, I did not know much about the Church of Wales. And it was thanks to an invitation from the community in Cardiff that I had to immediately reply positively. And I remember vividly, when I first got out of the car, there was this very nice-looking Welsh priest who welcomed me, and we embraced. Now, I don't know who this man is, but he was such a welcoming, warm brother, and then I realized that was Canon Patrick Thomas. That was the beginning of a beautiful friendship, and I believe brotherhood. We met many times since then. I've shared my vision, my programs, and my challenges with him, and he did the same thing with me. We've prayed together, we've discussed together many, many, many days and nights. And it was really thanks to Canon Patrick that I learned about the church in Wales, and I realized more and more how similar the two sister churches are, whether it's in London or in Cardiff or in St. David Cathedral, to make sure that these two communities get to know each other and stay closer to each other. After all, as I said earlier, there's one church, there's one universal church. Part of it speaks in Welsh, another part speaks in English, another part speaks in Armenian.
One of them was Elian Williams, an absolute rock, an absolute passionate person about the recognition of the Armenian genocide. He had started back in 2000, or even 1998, even earlier, trying slowly to get the Welsh government to recognise the genocide. Eventually, the Welsh government made two statements of opinions recognising the genocide. The Welsh government gave us a land for the memorial, and the Welsh government were present at the inauguration, at the unveiling of the monument on the 3rd of November 2007. The Armenian Genocide Monument in Cardiff. This monument is located in the Civic Centre, opposite the National Assembly building on King George V Avenue, and almost adjacent to the War Memorial. The memorial is made up of two different types of stone. The St. Bees stone, the pink coloured one, to resemble the Armenian tooth, and the slate from Wales. And this is to symbolise the marriage of the two cultures. Present at the opening ceremony were Bishop Nathan, Dr. Vahe Gabrielian from the Armenian Embassy, and Lord David Ellis Thomas, Speaker of the National Assembly. The plot was given to us by the Welsh Government and permission given by the Temple of Peace to erect this monument. Despite tremendous protests prior to the unveiling of the monument, it was successfully unveiled on the 3rd of November 2007. Not without some controversy, as while prayers were being said by the church in Wales and by the Armenian church, 350 plus protesters bussed in from London, paid for and bussed in from London, with megaphones, tried to disrupt the ceremony.
Where
I've noticed that sometimes when you talk about the Armenian genocide, people either don't know anything about it at all because it's been airbrushed out of the history books in so many ways, or else they regard it as something that they're not quite sure about, and that, I think, reflects some of the propaganda that has been used in different ways. On the whole, people have been interested, appalled often by the reality of what happened, rather than hostile, though I was very struck, obviously, when we had the dedication of the Kochar by the demonstrations that had been organised by Turkish extremists there, which really took me back. I mean, I was shocked by those because it was the only time in my experience as a priest in Wales that I'd been at a religious service which somebody had tried to disrupt. And I found that profoundly shocking. But also there was something wonderful about the dignity of the Armenian people in the middle of that raucous protest.
That's a very interesting point, because nations and individuals behave differently, and nations tend to safeguard their identity and their self-image perhaps with more vigour and force than individuals do. It's an interesting point. We're not responsible, I suspect, for the faults of our fathers and mothers, and yet we're very, very ready to take advantage of the advantages that they gain for us. So it has to be fair in both ways. And of course people need to realise that the 1915 genocide was not the only one which the Armenians suffered, you know, so that needs to be brought into awareness as well. I suppose in one sense there was nothing that the Western powers could do at the time, but certainly given the Holocaust afterwards and given Gladstone's interventions in the Balkans in the 1870s, then I think we should recognise and make some form of apology. Because if you're not ready to admit where you went wrong, that in effect desensitizes you. If you do admit it, if you apologize for it, then you can move on. You've liberated yourself and other people, both individually and as a nation, I think.
As I said, it wasn't without some controversy. On the 27th of January 2008, as we were preparing to celebrate Holocaust Memorial Day, the cross itself was completely shattered. The monument itself was damaged, and the hammer and other equipment used to damage was left behind. Unfortunately, the police couldn't find out who had vandalized the monument. For a year, there was a temporary wooden cross in place of the slate one, and then subsequently the wood was replaced with a new slate cross. The old slate cross was buried at the foot of the monument. Armenak Topalyan put together a group. This group had a specific task of seeking a legal opinion on why the United Kingdom would not recognize the Armenian genocide. The QC was the eminent human rights lawyer Geoffrey Robertson. Thanks to Armenak's initiative, we now have confirmation in writing of what we suspected. And I would like to read just the conclusion. It's on page 39. And this is the conclusion by Geoffrey Robertson QC, Doughty Street Chambers, and at the launch of the legal opinion on the 3rd of November 2009. It said, "I consider that Parliament has been routinely misinformed by ministers who have recited foreign and commercial office briefs without questioning their accuracy. Her Majesty's government's real and only policy has been to evade truthful answers to the questions about the Armenian genocide, because the truth would discomfort the Turkish government. As I said, we all suspected it. With information obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, Geoffrey Robertson QC has put together a superb document, and the conclusion, as I said, was to be expected. It is a pity that there is not a moral obligation, and that there is only the commercial and military obligation which the UK government is adhering to.
I think the theme of the book essentially is a discovery of Armenia from a Welsh viewpoint. It covers all sorts of historical and spiritual themes from Armenia, and then tries to relate them as well to things within the Welsh experience that Welsh people could understand and relate to. And it's also, I think, perhaps an attempt to express the way in which encountering Armenia and Armenians and Armenian history and the Armenian Church has enriched my life. I become so interested by my visits there that I'd read a great deal, sadly not in Armenian because my Armenian wasn't good enough, but in English and in French about Armenia, and had reached the stage where I'd accumulated a great mass of knowledge and I felt I ought to do something with it. But also, Armenia had fascinated me so much, and the Armenian culture, Armenian history, that I felt it was important that my fellow Welsh people should learn a little bit about it as well. Well, the research had taken a few years, but the actual writing was something that happened quite quickly. Obviously, in the sort of work that I do, if you're doing any writing, you have to write in any sort of spare moment that you have. But it took me a few months to write. Well, St. David was a holy man who lived in the 6th century. And there are lots of stories about him. His life was written by a monk named Rhygavarch many centuries later, about 4 centuries later. So people are not quite sure how much history there is in it and how much is legend. But he established a community here that was based very much on the communities in Egypt. It says in the life of St. David that his monks lived a life like the monks of Egypt. So it was a fairly hard, tough life based on that of the Desert Fathers. And the tradition also says that St. David traveled to Jerusalem, where he was consecrated as bishop, or possibly even archbishop for the Welsh, by the Patriarch of Jerusalem. So it's interesting, that idea that he went to the east for his inspiration. It began with my first visit to Armenia, that I became fascinated by Armenia, and indeed I've returned to Armenia several times since then. I think my last visit was my 5th visit, and I found myself intrigued by the culture, the history, the fact that East and West came together there, the fact that this was the oldest Christian nation, and it brought a whole lot of strands of ideas that were completely new to me, and yet there were also things there that seemed familiar to me from Wales as well. So I found myself making some links, but also wanting to teach people here in Wales a little bit about Armenia. And it seems to have been fairly successful so far. It was indeed. Waterstones in Carmarthen had it as their #1 bestseller for several weeks, which was, again, quite a surprise. I've been asked to speak as well to an awful lot of organisations and clubs and committees in Wales about Armenia since the book came out, so that's been rather a helpful thing. Well, the new book is called Remembering the Armenian Genocide, 1915 to 2015. And it's a book that I felt compelled to write in a way because I'd been told by so many people that they didn't know anything about the Armenian genocide. And it's perhaps because of the way in which the genocide has been airbrushed out of history by an awful lot of writers and commentators. And for me, because of my closeness that I feel to the Armenians now, I think this is something of huge importance. And it's a help to end that ignorance that there is of one of the most appalling incidents in the history of the 20th century, and one that's been denied, and I think the denial of the genocide is something that makes me angry.
Community in Wales would like to express its deepest gratitude to two Welshmen. One I've already mentioned, Elian Williams. Without Elian, we would be nowhere. He has, for 14 years, supported the recognition of the Armenian genocide. He has pushed every button to ensure that the Armenians are remembered in Wales. By the same token, how can we express our gratitude to Canon Patrick Thomas, who has put a motion forward and that has recognized the 24th of April as Armenian Genocide Day in all the Church in Wales churches, to be remembered every 24th of April. These are exceptional people, friends of the Armenians, friends of Armenia. We must honor them, and I don't know how.